The year is 2021. The world is still reeling from a pandemic and America stands at the crossroads of its democracy. January 6 was meant to be another step in the peaceful transfer of power. Instead, it became a day of chaos, uncertainty and violence. But what if the rioters had done more than breach the walls of the Capitol? What if their insurrection had truly succeeded? In this alternate history, the pillars of American democracy tremble and the world watches as the fate of the United States takes a dark and dangerous turn. Welcome to America Burns Part 1. Before we begin, let me briefly ask you to subscribe so you don't miss the next parts in this series. Also, I need to make a quick disclaimer. This is not a politically motivated video. I know that the topic is quite controversial, especially with the election going on right now. However, this video is meant to be entertaining and entertaining only. Of course, I have political opinions like pretty much everyone, but I've tried my very best to keep them out of this video. I hope you enjoy this scenario and as always, take everything I say with a grain of salt. Now, with that out of the way, what do I even mean by the January 6 rioters winning? Technically, they kind of succeeded in our timeline since the main goal was to stop the election count, which they did. However, they did not manage to keep Trump in power. That was their main goal in our timeline, and it's the same here. Also during the riots, many chanted slogans like "Hang Mike Pence" or "Where's Nancy?" And some rioters even constructed a gallows in front of the Capitol building. It's up to debate if they constructed it purely for symbolical reasons or they indeed intended to hang Mike Pence and other senators there. For the purposes of this scenario, I will assume the latter was their intent. So their goal is to punish certain politicians for their quote-unquote treason and keep Trump in power. Let's talk about what needs to change in the build-up to the insurrection for it to be truly successful. One thing about January 6 that was strange to me for a long time is how the rioters weren't carrying any guns or rifles. America, after all, is a very armed nation with mass shootings happening way too often. One explanation is that many of the Trump supporters didn't expect to storm the Capitol that day. I assume, and many probably believed, that the protests wouldn't turn as violent as they did. Most of the crowd probably expected to demonstrate in front of the Capitol, not to breach the Senate chambers. Thus, they weren't prepared for that at all. That's not true for all of them, however. Groups like the Proud Boys or Oath Keepers did in fact plan on violence and potentially storming the Capitol. They came in tactical gear equipped with bulletproof vests, walkie-talkies and smaller weapons like baseball bats. In order for the riots to become more successful and actually have a chance of capturing senators, we need at least some militant groups to be better armed. Also, we need the attack on the Capitol to be better coordinated. To do that, we will slightly change Trump's rhetoric before January 6. Like in our timeline, he will claim that the election was stolen and that the count was illegal. In this timeline, he will double down on this claim even harder. Trump will be quoted saying phrases like "Patriots need to stand up and fight for our country," and he suggests that drastic measures might be needed to restore democracy in the USA. Militant groups like the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers and many more interpret his words as a direct call to arms. They then begin extensive planning in late December. They use encrypted channels like Telegram to coordinate their efforts and acquire firearms and other tactical gear. Some even build improvised explosives like pipe bombs. Trump makes a viral tweet on Truth Social where he claims that January 6 is the last chance to stop the illegal election of Joe Biden. He announces that he will hold a speech in DC, not far from the Capitol, like in our timeline. Enrique Tarrio, the de facto leader of the Proud Boys, begins to prepare his militant group for the day. They acquire layout plans of the Capitol building, pinpoint weak points and strategic escape routes they need to cut off in order to capture the senators. In our timeline, Tarrio was arrested 2 days before January 6, so he was not present. In this timeline, he is hell-bent on being at the event, which he and his group views the day they will save America. Similarly to the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers and other groups also begin to specifically plan to storm the Capitol. But the rioters being better prepared and armed aren't the only thing that we need to change for the insurrection to be successful. As you all probably know, law enforcement in our time failed to identify the threat beforehand, even though many signs of it happening were visible. Many officials, including the Capitol Police and federal agencies, underestimated the threat the rioters posed. There was a strong belief that the protests would be similar to previous Trump gatherings, which remained largely peaceful. Thanks to Trump's stronger rhetoric, some members within law enforcement agencies do in fact notice the threat beforehand. However, many Republican-leaning officers and Trump supporters within law enforcement downplay the threat and ignore warnings, mostly because they are at least partially sympathetic to the cause and don't want to upset the Trump base. Many key figures within the US law enforcement deliberately sabotage any efforts made by their colleagues to meet the threat the rioters pose. Shortly before the riot, many independent journalists and the media warn about the potential for violence on January 6. However, neither the FBI nor the Capitol Police take them as serious as they should. I will make one more very important change in this timeline. The Capitol Police officer, Eugene Goodman, is sick on January 6 and not present in the Capitol at all. In our timeline, he alone lured a chunk of the rioters away from senators being evacuated from the Senate chamber. Many consider him to be the hero of January 6 for his calm and effective actions, despite facing an overwhelming crowd. Without Eugene Goodman, it is entirely possible, and quite likely actually, that rioters would have reached members of Congress, potentially taking hostages or worse. His absence alone would have had a big impact on the way the event unfolded, and possibly the future of America as we know it. Now that we have all the build-up changes covered, we can think about how the day unfolds. Let's begin by talking about the initial protests and Trump's speech, a speech that will be mentioned in countless history books of this alternate timeline. It is estimated that between 10,000 and 30,000 people attended Donald Trump's rally in Washington on January 6th. For the sake of this scenario, I will go with the higher end of the estimates and assume that around 30,000 people attended the rally. In our time, of those 30,000, only around 2,000 actually reached the Capitol itself, with most marching towards the Capitol peacefully. Furthermore, over 1,100 individuals have been arrested in relation to the insurrection for violent acts or the unlawful entry into the Capitol. To think that only around 2,000 people caused this much damage and came insanely close to encountering senators is truly scary. Now imagine if, thanks to a different rhetoric in Trump's speech and a general stronger sentiment that democracy is at stake, the majority of the attendees of the rally breached the Capitol. Instead of 2,000 people making their way onto Capitol grounds, it's over 10,000 people. I don't want to argue about how much Trump's speech, where he called for a quote, peaceful and patriotic march towards the Capitol, is responsible for the insurrection, but it's safe to say that a more radical sounding speech would have led to a worse outcome. In this timeline, Trump doesn't use words like peaceful in his speech. He still doesn't directly call for violence, but he strongly suggests it through phrases like, only hard patriotism can save our nation, and fight like hell. Of course, he still claims that the election was stolen. He blames multiple members of Congress like Nancy Pelosi directly. He also directly calls his Vice President Mike Pence a traitor. In the ending portion of the speech, Trump explains to the crowd that if the election isn't stopped, America will never again be a democracy. This rattles the crowd even more, and now they're ready for blood. The crowd of 30,000 people slowly makes their way towards the Capitol. This time, however, they are far more motivated, better prepared, and out for blood. Leading the charge towards the Capitol are paramilitary groups like the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. They are the first ones to arrive at the gates of the Capitol Hill at roughly 1 p.m. Most of them are heavily armed, but they don't immediately start an all-out assault. At first, the rioters just push against the fences, chant and throw random things like bottles at police officers. Slowly but steadily, as more and more people reach the Capitol, the riot slowly escalates. Like in our timeline, the Capitol Police is completely understaffed. It was clear both in this time and ours that there was a serious security risk, yet no clear actions were taken to meet the risk. Practically the only thing the Capitol Police did was set up barricades and fences. Neither the National Guard nor other reinforcements were immediately present during the beginning of the riot. Despite even clear warnings from the media, the international community, and members of the intelligence community, the Capitol Hill is critically understaffed. On top of that, like I mentioned before, the hero of January 6, Eugene Goodman, is on sick leave. The initial barricades the Capitol Police set up are quickly overwhelmed. Proud Boys and other rioters in tactical gear begin to push through them with force and their superior numbers. The Capitol Police officers still haven't realized how big the threat truly is. By this point, they are in the disbelief that the rioters are unarmed and pose no lethal threat. What they don't know is that over 300 of the rioters are carrying guns. They are all members of paramilitary groups like the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and so on. Their leaders, like Enrique Tarrio, explicitly instructed them to only use their weapons if absolutely necessary and to hide them until that point. Since assault rifles are not too easy to hide, most of them carry handguns concealed underneath their clothing. So far, from the perspective of the Capitol Police, nothing much has changed between our timeline and this timeline, except the crowd size. The rioters quickly reach the steps of the Capitol. While doing so, many of them directly clash with the Capitol Police. However, they still haven't fired a single shot, and so far nobody has died. However, multiple rioters and police officers have been injured during the clashes. The police uses pepper spray and batons, while the rioters mostly use makeshift weapons like fire extinguishers or flagpoles. The sheer size of the crowd, which never meets a coordinated defense, quickly reaches multiple entry points of the Capitol. Capitol Police tries desperately to stop the mob from breaking into the Capitol, but their fight is a hopeless one. It's only a question of time until the insurgents break into the Capitol building from the western and eastern side respectively. The Capitol Police repeatedly calls for backup, but thanks to Trump's efforts, it takes hours for the National Guard to arrive. Nobody inside the Capitol has a clue what horrors are about to be unleashed on them. Like in our timeline, senators and members of the House were put into lockdown instead of being evacuated. This happened because of how strongly the threat was underestimated. By this point in time, the Capitol Police doesn't know that a decent amount of the rioters is carrying guns with the intent to capture or execute members of Congress. Nancy Pelosi and Mike Pence are also still carrying out their duties at around 1:30 p.m. when rioters begin to bang against windows and doors of the Capitol. At 1:40 p.m., around 30 minutes earlier than in our time, rioters break into the Capitol on the Senate side of the building. In our timeline, the Capitol Police managed to initially hold back the mob on the eastern side. In this time, thanks to the bigger crowd, Capitol Police fails to do so, and only shortly after the first breach, rioters managed to break into the eastern side of the Capitol as well. Within minutes, hundreds of protesters stormed inside the Capitol. The security inside is completely overwhelmed, especially with the lack of their hero, Eugene Goodman. The mob quickly makes their way towards the Senate chamber, similarly to our timeline. For now, they are one level below the Senate, Senate, which at this very moment is called into recess. Senate members are asked to evacuate down 2 flights of stairs. At this point in time, Eugene Goodman managed to reach the stairs before the rioters did. He was the only thing standing between rioters and fleeing lawmakers. While keeping his composure, he lured the rioters away from the escape routes towards reinforcements. Well, as you know, in this scenario, Goodman is not at the Capitol. Also, the rioters are pushing inside more aggressively. Within minutes after breaching the Capitol, they managed to reach evacuating senators. And as you can guess, the group leading the rioters are the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, who carry concealed weapons. Now, at around 2 p.m., the rioters reached the doors of the Senate chamber and cut off both escape routes. At this point, the police officers and security guards present draw their guns as the lives of many important politicians and lawmakers are at stake. The officers threaten the rioters that any step further will be met with lethal force. The rioters, however, don't back down. Instead, those who carry weapons quickly draw them. One Secret Service agent fires the first shot as a rioter is charging towards him, which results in a brutal firefight. The officers, especially the Secret Service agents, are better trained than the Proud Boys, but they have a numerical disadvantage. In the meantime, the senators were instructed to take off their pins that identify them and to hide behind chairs as the gunfight is raging on, right in front of the Senate. By this point, the law enforcement agencies are informed about the gunfight, and the threat level is immediately escalated. The National Guard is called and other law enforcement units make their way towards the Capitol. Within minutes, the situation turned from a riot into the most serious threat against American democracy since the Civil War. Donald Trump at this point in time is sitting in the dining room in the White House watching the events unfold on television. At 2:10 p.m., the firefight in front of the Senate ends, with the rioters successfully overwhelming the officers. They quickly storm into the Senate, many live streaming the whole event to hundreds of thousands of viewers. The rioters then quickly find the senators hiding and begin to take them hostage. Many pose with them while they are being tied up, and the images reach global news within minutes. Just imagine the look on Donald Trump's face as he's watching national television where pictures of his supporters taking his vice president Mike Pence hostage are taken. An iconic photo is taken of Trump reacting to the chaos, similarly to the images of George Bush when he was informed about 9/11. But besides Mike Pence, who else was in the Senate at the time? Mitch McConnell was the Senate Majority Leader at the time and a key figure in the Republican Party. Like Mike Pence, he was one of the main targets of the rioters. Another important politician is the Democratic Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who would also have been a prime target. Besides them, many well-known figures like Mitt Romney and Bernie Sanders also get captured. But not everyone in the Senate is an enemy of the insurgents. Both Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley were present on January 6 and supported Trump's claim of election fraud. At this point, Proud Boys and other insurgents are arguing what to do with the captured politicians. Just for your information, while the Senate has 100 members, not all of them were present on January 6. For example, Kamala Harris, who was elected vice president, was not present. Also, some managed to evacuate or hide from the threat. The insurgents have successfully taken around 30 senators hostage. Many want to make true in their "Hang Mike Pence" chant. However, Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, and leaders of the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers urged the blood-hungry insurgents to use the senators as leverage and not to harm them. While they are infighting on what to do with the hostages, the images of tied-up Mike Pence reach global headlines. The National Guard still hasn't made their way to the Capitol, and the protesters outside, emboldened by the actions going on inside, pour into the Capitol one after another. While the Senate was breached, another group of rioters made their way to the House. Inside the House, the members are hastily evacuated as news about the hostage situation in the Senate has reached them. But not only the House has got the news, the approaching insurgents also got the message both from the media and through their accomplices. Leading the charge once again are members of the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. They view the hostage situation as a green light for more violent action. They draw their weapons and force their way towards the House in a brutal fashion, killing several officers on their way. As the rioters blast their way towards the House, chaos inside the House ensues. Members begin to panic as Secret Service agents try their best to evacuate them. Nancy Pelosi, like the other members, desperately tries to evacuate through a back way. Rioters chanting for Pelosi's execution close in on them, while the Secret Service desperately tries to hold a defensive line. Unlike in the Senate, neither the leaders of the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers nor Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley are present. Thus, nobody urges the bloodthirsty crowd to leverage the situation and take hostages. As the rioters find the House empty of Pelosi, they quickly spread out in an attempt to find her, while other members are getting tied up and beaten. Within minutes, a small group of Oath Keepers find Nancy Pelosi's staff trying to hide her in an empty office room. They engage in a firefight while Pelosi tries to run for cover. While the Secret Service manages to overwhelm them, a single bullet has hit Nancy Pelosi in the head, killing her instantly. Even worse, one of the attackers wore a GoPro live streaming the whole event to a sizable audience. The news of Nancy Pelosi's death at 2:34 p.m. quickly reached the media and Donald Trump. By now, the whole world awaits for how he will respond to the crisis. While the media is nervously awaiting a response from Donald Trump, his advisors desperately urge him to address the nation. Instead of doing so, the first thing Donald Trump does is open a certain app called Twitter. Many of his advisors urged him multiple times not to address the nation via Twitter and to prepare a detailed response first. They also urge him to help de-escalate the situation to avoid legal consequences and backlash. Of course, Trump doesn't listen, and his first tweet reads something like this. Thank you to the great patriots of America for standing up for our country and our constitution. Today you showed the world that you can't mess with America without facing big consequences. We will always win for democracy. #MAGA. As you probably noticed, the tweet neither acknowledges the hostage situation nor calls for de-escalation. It actually has quite the opposite effect, with MAGA supporters all over the US beginning to travel towards Washington DC. Everyone else is shocked by the tweet, and different media outlets like CNN and MSNBC call Trump a traitor and coward. They urge him repeatedly to call for de-escalation without any success. Within minutes of the tweet, Americans all over begin to view Trump as a traitor and fear that he is in fact trying to overthrow Congress in order to stay in power. In this timeline, many Americans panic that if they don't take quick actions, they could lose their precious democracy to Donald Trump. In the next minutes and hours, Trump will put out several more tweets, all with a similar message. Nancy Pelosi was shot by left-wing radicals trying to escalate the situation. This infuriates a large chunk of the public, since many can see through the lie with ease. As a side note that's definitely not meant to be foreshadowing, can you guess in what situation a country is most likely to experience a civil war? You might think it's under a brutal dictatorship where the people try to rise up, or under a strong political crisis. While those are really good guesses with some truth to them, the easiest way to bring a nation to civil war is to strip a significant amount of rights away from the people or threaten to do so. If the American public would seriously fear that Trump is taking away their freedom for good, they wouldn't just sit and watch. Thanks to widespread media coverage of Trump's response, many left-leaning Americans and moderates quickly take to the streets. In New York, a giant crowd gathers in front of the Trump Tower, at first peacefully calling for action against him, but the situation quickly escalates. Protests turn into brutal riots in many cities like LA, Chicago, and many more. The protests quickly reach similar violence levels as the BLM protests at the peak a year earlier. The media is scrambling on what to report on. On the one side, cities begin to burn as protests target government buildings and police cars. The mayor of New York is the first to declare crisis and calls the National Guard to aid in de-escalation. Roughly at the same time, the National Guard at 3:50 p.m. has reached Washington DC and the Capitol building. In the meantime, the insurgents weren't just sitting around. Trump's tweet emboldened them greatly and they viewed it as proof they did the right thing. Inside the Capitol, the insurgents quickly established a chain of command led by Enrique Tarrio, the leader of the Proud Boys, who are the ones who took most senators hostage. The insurgents are roughly split into three groups. The hardcore members, like the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, who are heavily armed, organized and prepared for practically anything. Then less armed but still highly motivated and organized individuals from various smaller far-right groups, and finally just the regular MAGA Conspiracy Joe, who happened to be in Washington at the time and went along with the flow. The core group of Proud Boys and Oath Keepers take care of guarding the hostages and entrances to the House and Senate. The others are ordered to protect escape routes and any entrances to the Capitol. By now, around 10,000 insurgents are inside the Capitol, which is completely under their control, and another 30,000 are outside, putting up a fight against the National Guard. With each hour passing, more and more rioters reach the Capitol, with law enforcement struggling to keep them out of DC. The National Guard outside manages to steadily make their way to the Capitol entrances. However, they can't go inside, since Enrique Tarrio published a video claiming that any attempt to enter the Capitol by the military will be met with the execution of the Vice President Mike Pence and others. Donald Trump is still in the White House at this point as he watches the situation unfold on national television. He sees images of the National Guard dispersing the MAGA crowds in front of the Capitol, rioters entering the Trump Tower, and cities like LA going up in flames with the National Guard on their way. While so far everyone urged him to call for de-escalation, even his children, now a different advice reaches his ear. Stephen Miller pulls Trump away from the television screen into a private briefing room. He explains to the president that if he doesn't take swift action now and leverage the situation, he will go to prison and be seen as a traitor. Trump, of course, as you all know, really doesn't want to go to prison, so he actually listens to his advisor. Miller advises Trump that by now the best course of action is to declare martial law. Many cities experience heavy violence and some of the most important members of Congress are held hostage. Miller also emphasizes that declaring martial law will ensure Trump's grip on power, at least temporarily. If they manage to handle the crisis correctly, Trump will stay in power and Joe Biden and other Democrats could be blamed and arrested for treason. Trump, upon hearing this, of course gets excited. The whole reason why he held the rally in Washington at the first place was because he in fact wanted to stay in power. Together with Miller, Trump quickly prepares a speech to address the nation and declare martial law. But at first Trump needs to invoke the Insurrection Act, not because he actually wants to know, but because immediately declaring martial law would be viewed as too harsh of a reaction and would most likely result in large chunks of the military turning against him. The thing about martial law is that it can be used in multiple ways to manipulate power, which is why declaring it is such a controversial thing to do. For example, after declaring martial law because of civil unrest, Trump's cabinet can basically control the media. He could censor left-leaning media channels like CNN and MSNBC and only publish narratives that support his claim of election fraud. Trump could theoretically stay in power if he plays his cards correctly and slowly but steadily escalates his level of control. While Trump is invoking the Insurrection Act, the situation on Capitol Hill has calmed down. The insurgents are in full control of the Capitol and in heavy negotiations with the military. Enrique Tarrio makes a deal with the military. In exchange for 5 Democratic senators, the military provides him with a direct line to Donald Trump. The US military hopes that through Trump the situation will de-escalate, and if pushed enough, Trump will give in and urge Tarrio to release the hostages. Trump's cabinet quickly lies about the phone line between Trump and Tarrio and claims that it was established to negotiate a release of the hostages, not to further plan on how to leverage the situation. Trump urges Tarrio to hold on and under no circumstances allow the military into the Capitol. He explains that he will declare martial law and push for the arrests of senators like Mike Pence and co. The Capitol quiets down as the military has successfully removed all rioters outside the building. On the inside, the insurgents still hold full control. In the meantime, every large American city is basically up in flames. Rioters' calls for the arrest of Donald Trump grow louder and louder as the sun is setting and the darkness takes over. Now the fires set by the rioters burn even brighter. On January 7 at 11:25 a.m., Donald Trump steps onto the White House grounds and formally declares martial law in response to the civil unrest around the nation. How will America react to Trump's declaration of martial law? Will the military back Donald Trump? After nationwide riots broke out as a response to the insurrection, Trump knew that in order to stay in power, he needed to declare martial law. However, before Trump declared martial law, he invoked the Insurrection Act. He didn't do so because he necessarily wanted to, but because immediately declaring martial law would have been risky. After all, Trump doesn't want it to look like a coup. In our timeline, members of the Oath Keepers had actual plans to bring more weapons into the Capitol if Trump invoked the Insurrection Act, which he never did in our time. However, their plans quickly fell flat in this timeline. By the time Trump declared the Insurrection Act, the Capitol is completely surrounded by the National Guard. Inside the Capitol, Enrique Tarrio is in control of the situation. The countless insurgents follow his command and Tarrio himself directly follows the words of Donald Trump. Shortly before Trump declared martial law, Tarrio negotiated for a direct military line of communication between him and Trump in exchange for 5 senators. Together they began to plan for how they can remove the senators out of DC so Trump can trial them. Do they actually have a chance of securing DC, or will the National Guard present turn on Donald Trump? We will soon find out, but first let's take a look on how the public, military and world reacts to the declaration of martial law. On January 7 at 11:25 a.m., Donald Trump stepped onto the White House grounds and formally declared martial law in a speech. He claims that martial law is necessary to defend the integrity of the American democracy. He again makes claims about widespread voter fraud and would use the nationwide riots as justification. He blames left-wing radicals for inciting the violence and for being responsible for the death of Nancy Pelosi. Trump is quoted saying both, "I promise swift action to reclaim control," and "Patriots need to stand firm." These phrases further pour oil into the fire as the nation begins to completely divide itself. Immediately after his speech, Trump, with the help of his advisors, would suspend habeas corpus. In practice, that means that anyone can now be arrested without the need for a charge. This would give Trump the power to arrest political opponents, members of Congress, journalists, activists, and basically anyone who's opposing him. Trump will soon use this power to declare that the capture of the senators, including Mike Pence, was lawful. He orders the military in Washington, D.C. to stand down and shortly after, in private, tells Enrique Tarrio to wait for further instructions as the situation develops. The military initially abides Trump's order to stand down in D.C. However, voices inside the National Guard present at the Capitol whisper about plans to remove Trump from power. Joe Biden, meanwhile, is quickly made aware about the danger. During the declaration of martial law, Biden was staying in Washington, D.C. However, now with the situation rapidly deteriorating, he and his cabinet moved to an undisclosed location in Delaware, his home state. They're still in close proximity to D.C., but now in a firm blue area that is far safer. Of course, neither Donald Trump nor the world know at this point where they are located. Less than an hour after the speech, the US is already in complete chaos. Both traditional media and social media are completely up in flames. Conservative media outlets like Fox News back Donald Trump and blame Mike Pence, Joe Biden, and practically all Democrats for the current chaos. More progressive media outlets like CNN and MSNBC push for a different narrative. They call Trump's action a coup and call for the military to disobey his orders and arrest him. As you can imagine, social media on January 7 would be a total hellscape. Thanks to the powers granted by martial law, Donald Trump can order the shutdown of any social media he wants. However, as you probably know, tech giants like Facebook, Twitter, and Google are traditionally progressive, with their headquarters in democratic states like California and Washington. often. So social media sites like Twitter, Instagram and Facebook resist Trump's call and instead ban accounts linked to him. In return, the Trump administration uses their power to try to shut down Twitter and co. in many regions across the US. You can expect that in red states like Texas and Florida, Twitter will be banned within hours. A cat and mouse game between Trump's administration and tech giants erupts, leading to countless banned accounts, removed content, cyber attacks and entire social media blackouts. In rural areas across the continental US, Trump loyalists would begin to prepare themselves. They would quickly gather firearms, explosives and tactical gear. Tens of thousands of rural Americans would organize into pro-Trump militia groups akin to the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. At the same time, institutions in democratic-leaning areas like major cities and states like California would begin to call Trump's action a coup. Imagine assets being frozen, countless documents seized and so on. Also, as you've probably expected, the stock market would experience a large-scale crash. Riots against Trump in these areas would get significantly worse, with New York City being hit the hardest. Countless people would storm into the Trump Tower, completely overwhelming the officers there. While martial law was already declared, the city is in deep chaos. Also, many military officials flat out refused to stop the rioters. Anything associated with Donald Trump would be a target of the rioters, who would quickly organize themselves into groups. Imagine Fox News headquarters and similar places being stormed by anti-Trump protesters. While the right-wing rural groups organize into militias like the Proud Boys, the urban left organizes a little differently. You can expect them to use similar tactics as the Hong Kong protesters in 2020, at least in the beginning. Trump of course also calls for law enforcement to arrest key figures in the early opposition. He orders the FBI to arrest key Democratic officials who in his view participated in the election fraud. This includes key governors like Gavin Newsom and Andrew Cuomo, both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, tech CEOs like Jack Dorsey, the back then CEO of Twitter, journalists, media figures and anti-Trump Republicans like Liz Cheney. The FBI's leader Christopher Wray and the leader of the CIA Gina Haspel are hesitant to follow through on Trump's order and call their agents to stand down. However, many factions within the FBI and CIA are loyal to Trump and they try their best to follow through on his commands. After Trump gets wind about the FBI's and CIA's betrayal, he also orders the arrests of Christopher Wray and Gina Haspel. This quickly results in the FBI overthrowing Christopher Wray. They declare their full loyalty to Donald Trump as they appoint a new leader and purge anyone not loyal to Father Trump. The CIA, on the other hand, remains more staunchly anti-Trump, with Gina Haspel staying in power. After the coup, the FBI quickly begins to follow through on Donald Trump's order and they begin to arrest journalists and media figures. However, most important politicians and individuals are completely undercover by now. Also, while the FBI is trying to arrest them, the CIA is covertly providing key intelligence to Joe Biden and other politicians. The Supreme Court tries their best to as quickly as possible make a ruling on the legitimacy of Trump's actions. Thanks to some handsome promises and a threat here and there, they rule in favor of Donald Trump. However, at this point, nobody really cares about their rulings anymore, as practically all law and order has left the nation. While this sounds like a lot, it all happened in a very short time span. Donald Trump declared martial law on January 7 at 11:25 a.m. Everything I mentioned by now happened before 3 p.m. the same day. As the initial dust is settling and the scale of the situation becomes clear to the world, the true factions begin to emerge. While red areas hold more resources like oil, blue areas control a large chunk of the American economy. However, the future of this conflict lies in the hands of Joe Biden and how he will respond. While the chaos was unfolding, Joe Biden got visited by several important figures in his hideout in Delaware. This includes key military officials like Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, which makes him the top military official in the US at the time. He is known for his commitment to democratic principles and the Constitution. However, his role is more advisory and his ability to directly deploy troops is limited without the chain of command firmly on his side. Other important military officials include Michael Gilday, the Chief of Naval Operations, and General Charles Q. Brown Jr., the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Next to them, various figures from the National Guard and Special Operations also support Biden. Besides military officials, Joe Biden also consults with key politicians, mainly blue state governors like Gavin Newsom from California, Andrew Cuomo from New York, and Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan. Of course, Kamala Harris is completely standing behind Biden. In fact, her work is crucial as she's working to contact various factions in an attempt to gather further support. While Biden is busy consulting military officials and politicians, Kamala Harris consults the CIA and many tech companies. Together, Biden's coalition discussed what their best course of action is based on the current situation. To summarize, they have practically two choices. Either they can throw in the towel and flee the nation, continuing to work against Donald Trump in exile. However, as you can probably guess, Biden doesn't want to do that, and only a few advisors even seriously suggested it. Fleeing the nation now would undermine his role as the rightful president. Also, Trump's grip on power is not strong enough for Biden's team to be hopeless. Many cracks are already showing, like the defiance of tech companies, the CIA, and the widespread riots. It is also unclear by this point how loyal many individuals truly are to Trump. The other option is of course to resist Donald Trump in an attempt to regain power. As you can probably guess, this is what they chose. Joe Biden and practically anyone important on his side agrees that the best course for America is to end Trump's reign once and for all. Joe Biden knows that defying Donald Trump could easily lead to a full-scale civil war. Of course, neither Biden nor any of his advisors want that, but they are willing to go through with their actions if they don't have any other choice. By now, the Biden team agrees that the best first step is to appeal to US constitutions like the courts, negotiate with military leaders to ensure resource and military installations are under their control, and to gather international support. Biden appeals to NATO, the European Union and other allied nations like Canada and the UK in an attempt to gain their support. He wants them to denounce Trump's presidency, but many nations are hesitant to follow through, as they fear that Biden isn't able to regain power. However, for now, Biden's next step is to address the nation. At 4 p.m. on January 7, media outlets all over the world report that Joe Biden will hold a televised speech addressing the situation in the nation at 5 p.m. Trump's administration scrambles in preparation and tries with full force to shut down media outlets like CNN. Their goal is to censor the speech as best as possible. However, in today's day and age, that's almost impossible. At exactly 5 p.m., Joe Biden goes live in front of a grey wall in an undisclosed location. His speech is viewed by millions of Americans across countless platforms. Of course, CNN, MSNBC and international news agency like BBC broadcast it. It is also live streamed on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and so on. On top of that, many cities publicly broadcast the speech. For example, thousands of people watch it together in Times Square. Many right-wing loyalists within blue cities use this as an opportunity to conduct terrorist attacks against the public viewings. In Times Square, several pipe bombs go off, killing over 10 people. But let's focus on the speech itself now. Joe Biden tries his best in the speech to walk a fine line between projecting strength, unity and legitimacy, while trying not to escalate the situation any further. Here's the beginning of the speech. Also forgive me for not doing a Biden impression, I'm not a good impressionist. My fellow Americans, today we find ourselves at a critical juncture in our nation's history. I come before you not as a politician, but as your elected president, a servant of the people, entrusted to uphold the values of our democracy and the Constitution that has guided us for over 2 centuries. Our country has been thrown into chaos by forces that seek to divide us, by individuals who refuse to accept the will of the people and the peaceful transfer of power, a hallmark of our republic since its founding. Let me be clear, the events unfolding are not just a threat to me or to one political party, they are a threat to all of us, to the very fabric of America. We have seen armed insurrectionists, fueled by lies and misinformation, take our leaders hostage, attack our institutions, and try to impose their will through violence and fear. But America does not bow to fear. We have faced civil war, world wars, economic depression, and terrorist attacks. And in every instance, we have come together, united by our shared belief in liberty, justice, and equality. I understand the fear and uncertainty many of you feel right now, but this is not the time to give in to division. This is not the time to turn on each other. We must stand united. We must stand for democracy. We must stand for America. Of course, this wouldn't be the whole speech. Knowing that law enforcement and the military play a crucial role in this situation, Biden would directly appeal to them. He would remind them of their oath and their duty towards democracy and the Constitution. He would also directly address Trump supporters, deliberately not alienating them, but rather trying to appeal to their sense of justice and democracy. This is a crucial step in swaying moderates who are at least somewhat skeptical about Trump's intentions. In the ending portion, Biden would directly address allies like NATO, the EU and other democracies. He calls them to support the legitimate government of the US and urges them to denounce Trump. He reminds the world how important it is for global democracies to step up and support democratic governments in the face of authoritarianism. After Biden's speech, his coalition closely observes the various reactions across the nation. The already violent anti-Trump protests gather new momentum, while Trump's camp scrambles for a coordinated response. On social media sites, various high-ranking officials and public figures announce their support for Joe Biden. This is a strong sign, since speaking up against Trump right now seems like a very risky move, especially if you're a public figure. Biden's advisors urge him that now is the right time to take the next big step. However, they know that any wrong move could further escalate the situation, and with the fear of civil war growing inside Biden's circle, their paranoia is only increasing. After several intense hours of strategizing, the Biden administration finally comes to agreement on what their next move will be. The governors of several blue states make their way to safe and undisclosed locations inside their states. They are well aware that the action they will soon take will forever change history, for the better or worse. At 8:30 p.m. on January 7, the governors of California, New York, Michigan and several other blue states simultaneously declare their open defiance against Donald Trump in a coordinated, televised address. They voice sympathy for the anti-Trump rioters in their states and order both the National Guard and other institutions within their state to not follow through on any order made by Donald Trump. They declare their full loyalty to Joe Biden, who they view as the rightful president of the United States. The move is a huge gamble, but their hope is that they just sparked a chain reaction that will result in Trump's downfall. That, however, entirely depends on how the nation will react. Only minutes later, the streets of Los Angeles, New York, and many other cities erupt into celebrations. The pro-Biden demonstrators cheer, waving American flags and chanting slogans of freedom and democracy. Simultaneously, Trump loyalists within those cities brutally clash with police forces in an attempt to counter protest. The National Guard in blue states received clear instructions from their governors: ignore any orders from Washington and protect our citizens from Trump's illegal regime. Armed units of the National Guard now stand firm to defend against federal forces as they prepare for an inevitable crash. The pro-Trump protestants in blue states quickly get overwhelmed by both pro-Biden protesters and the National Guard, who now practically work together. By 9 p.m. it is confirmed that federal military units are being mobilized in red states. Shortly after, in his typical style, Donald Trump reacts to the open defiance. He's being interviewed live by Fox News and is quoted saying things like, "We will take back control of these corrupt states," and "Biden and his criminal governors will not steal this country from real Americans." Shortly after the interview, the governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, also declared defiance against Trump. This is significant for several reasons. First, Maryland is in close proximity to DC, and Larry Hogan is a Republican governor. However, as you can probably guess by his reaction, he was a vocal critic of Donald Trump throughout his career. For example, he neither endorsed him in 2016 or 2020. The US military seems to be split on the issue, with the Army and Marine Corps being mostly supportive of Trump, while the Air Force and Navy show strong signs of defiance, but more on that in a minute. Trump's allies in the military, led by General John H. Smith, begin to prepare to march towards DC, as the city is burning up in flames. Remember, by now the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers are still in control of the Capitol, with over 20 senators held hostage, including Mike Pence. Inside DC, the over 50,000 pro-Trump rioters are violently clashing with anti-Trump protesters. While the National Guard is present, they don't exactly help in de-escalating. Many are torn apart between their duty to the Constitution and personal support for Donald Trump. Small skirmishes inside the National Guard in DC break out between different units, with nobody having a clear overview on what's happening. Still, the majority of National Guard units in both DC and Maryland are loyal to Joe Biden, not Donald Trump, largely thanks to the fact that the governor of Maryland declared open defiance against Trump. While they are dealing with internal skirmishes and brutal rioters, the National Guard units are setting up defenses all around DC, as they are preparing for the inevitable arrival of stronger pro-Trump forces. In the meantime, Trump, with the help of the Secret Service, is covertly escorted out of DC and moved into Mar-a-Lago, his estate in Florida. However, DC is not the only place where larger military confrontations are brewing up. Loyal Trump forces inside red states, with the support of countless militia groups, prepare to march towards key Biden strongholds like California and New York. The blue faction is scrambling to set up defenses around state and city lines, as they are preparing for the inevitable. They hope that declaring open defiance would reveal cracks within the red faction. Now it is clear that the opposite is the truth. Trump's forces are looking scarily unified, with them having a clear goal in sight: crush the pro-Biden resistance and reclaim America for Donald Trump. By 10 p.m. the first pro-Trump army battalions arrive in Washington, D.C. They are met with thunderous cheers by the rioters while they make their way towards the Capitol. The first military confrontations happens at the intersection of Constitutional Avenue and 1st Street. A platoon of National Guard soldiers loyal to Biden, guarding the western approach of the Capitol, faced off against red forces led by John H. Smith. As the first directly faced each other, both sides remained hesitant to act. Then at 10:30 p.m. a single shot pierced the silence, setting off a chain reaction of gunfire that lights up the night sky. It is unclear who shot first, but it's now very clear that history is forever changed as the Battle of DC begins. Civil War is now certain. But before we dive into the first battle of the Second American Civil War, let me explain the two factions to you, so you can have a clear overview. After the open defiance of the blue state governors, it is now clear to anyone that America is headed for another civil war. How it will unfold is anyone's guess at this point, but one thing is very clear: who is fighting against whom. On one side you have the Trump administration trying to keep Trump in power, and on the other side you have the Biden coalition trying to remove Trump from power. For the sake of simplicity, I will be referring to these factions as the red and blue faction respectively. Anyway, while you might think that the factions are split along partisan lines, the reality is far more complex. Let's first talk about the red faction, aka the Trump administration. This faction is composed of Trump loyalists and supporters both from the public and within the government. Their core belief is that Trump is defending democracy from a corrupt system, being manipulated by elites, radicals, and the so-called deep state. Of course, Donald Trump is the leader of this faction, now ruling under martial law. Closely on his side are pro-Trump Republicans like Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott, the governors of Florida and Texas. In fact, those states and many other red states in the South and Midwest completely stand behind Donald Trump. Their state-owned National Guards are in full loyalty to Trump and their governors. Also on Trump's side are the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and many more right-wing militia groups. By now they are still holding the Capitol, with many important politicians like Mike Pence and Chuck Schumer being held hostage there. However, in the last 2 days, countless new members have joined these groups in support of Trump. They are well organized in rural and heavily conservative areas, ready to defend Trump to their death. Many of them are making active preparations to fight a guerrilla-style war, both in blue cities and on the red countryside. While the military itself is split, Trump commands a substantial number of loyal officers, especially the National Guard units in red states like Texas. Besides them, the Army and Marine Corps are largely loyal to Trump. Unlike the Navy and Air Force. On top of that, the FBI and many local police forces support Trump. One faction I haven't mentioned so far is the Secret Service. While their numbers aren't too substantial, they are mostly loyal to Trump, as it is their duty to protect him. However, some members tasked with protecting Biden and Harris have defected from Trump. Geographically, the Red faction is strong in the South, the rural Midwest, and mountain states. Their main bastions are Florida and Texas, with Trump for now residing in Florida. The biggest strength of the Red faction is their control over critical resources, thanks to their geography. They hold oil and gas-rich areas, ensuring that Trump's administration controls vital energy supplies. They also have control over vast amounts of food supplies, which could become crucial in a drawn-out conflict. But let's now talk about the Blue faction, aka Biden's coalition. The opposing faction, led by Joe Biden, is composed of anti-Trump Republicans, Democrats, and progressive leftists. Their primary goal is to restore constitutional democracy and end what they see as Trump's authoritarian coup. Their leader is Joe Biden, who they view as the rightful president of the US. Kamala Harris also plays a significant role, practically being the second in command after Biden. Other key figures include governors of blue states like Gavin Newsom in California, Andrew Cuomo in New York, and Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan. But besides Democratic governors, some anti-Trump Republicans like Liz Cheney also align themselves with Biden. Like the Red movement has their rural militia groups, the Blue faction has progressive movements in urban centers. For example, the still fairly fresh BLM movement or the Antifa. They are rapidly organizing, taking inspiration from the Hong Kong protesters a year earlier. Tech giants like Twitter, Google, and Facebook also strongly align themselves with Biden, allowing him to use social media to his advantage. Finally, a significant portion of the higher military command, such as General Mark Milley and others, align themselves with Biden, providing him with considerable military strength. While the Army and Marine Corps is largely on Trump's side, both the Navy and Air Force are practically completely loyal to Joe Biden. Geographically, the Blue faction controls the West Coast, the Northeast, and urban areas around the nation. Their key states include California, New York, and practically all of New England. This quickly reveals one of the Biden faction's greatest strengths, as they control a large chunk of the American economy. Many urban centers, Wall Street, Hollywood, and the Silicon Valley all lay in their control. Thanks to the loyalty of tech companies, the Blue factions also have superior communications channels. Before we continue with the battle for DC, I need to briefly mention the neutral factions. Mainly they are foreign powers like Russia, China, and the EU, who are hesitant to support a side, since the situation is still so fresh. However, that can change very soon. Now with the lines drawn, let us resume the first clash of the American Civil War, the battle for DC. Whoever gains control over DC will gain a significant morale boost that could be the deciding factor in winning the war. The fight inside DC spreads like a wildfire. Pro-Trump rioters, emboldened by the arrival of the Red forces, begin to attack National Guard units near the Capitol. The streets of the nation's capital, once filled with tourists and workers, now are filled with the sounds of gunfire and explosions. The rioters, armed with makeshift weapons, grow bolder with every minute. While the main goal of the pro-Trump forces is to secure DC, they have another order, one far more urgent. Inside the Capitol, hundreds of Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and other rioters are trapped, with over 20 senators still being held as hostages. The Capitol, though internally controlled by the Red forces, has become a death trap. Surrounded by Biden-loyal National Guard units, any attempt to break out seems like suicide. Trump, watching the events unfold from Mar-a-Lago, gives the order to focus all efforts in securing the White House and liberating the Capitol. For him, this battle is personal. His loyalists must be freed, not only to boost their morale, but also because he needs the senators alive. If he gets a hold of them, he can trial them publicly to send a powerful message to both his supporters and the world. But it's not just the Capitol in play. Other key battleground areas include vital choke points like Constitutional Avenue, which cuts through the heart of DC, and the bridges spanning the Potomac River. Control over these key routes will determine who can move troops and supplies through the city. As the battles escalate from sporadic skirmishes to full-on warfare, the streets of DC descend into chaos. Militia groups, sensing the growing danger, scatter. What began as a political protest has developed into urban warfare. Tens of thousands of pro-Trump rioters and militia groups now roam the city, trying to figure out how they can aid the Red forces, but their lack of organization leaves them vulnerable. Residents of DC, fearing for their lives, band together in makeshift defense units, setting up roadblocks and barricades in a desperate attempt to protect their neighborhoods from the mob. Local businesses, schools, and even churches are transformed into fortified positions, and the tensions thicken as the Red forces tighten their grip. The Biden coalition closely watches from a military bunker in Delaware. Their forces remain mostly intact, though shaken by the initial unrest. For now they have the upper hand, but only barely. Despite early chaos, Biden's forces have managed to set up defensive positions around the Capitol. Motivated by Biden's speech and the defiance of Republican governors like Larry Hogan, who pledged loyalty to Biden. His defiance was crucial in aligning DC's National Guard with the Blue forces, giving Biden a solid foothold in the city. However, the Red forces have their own advantages. Trump can muster a large army over time, pulling from militia groups across the nation and mobilizing local army units in the US Army. His numbers are growing. The longer the fight drags on, the more reinforcements he can call in, a reality that weighs heavily on the minds of Biden's commanders. One of the Blue faction's greatest assets is the Air Force. Though the Navy is useless in the battle for DC, the pro-Biden Air Force has established a strict no-fly zone, preventing Trump from deploying air reinforcements or conducting aerial attacks. Drones and helicopters patrol the skies, maintaining air superiority. This opens the door for a high-risk, high-reward maneuver, a helicopter rescue of the trapped senators. It's a long shot, but Biden knows the political and psychological cost of losing the senators to Trump's forces would be catastrophic. As both sides dig in for a longer fight, the ground war rages. Urban combat is hellish, with both National Guard and Red militias fighting for every street corner and building. Inside the Capitol, Red forces barricade themselves in hallways and chambers, using the building's architecture to their advantage. While they hear the battles raging on outside, the insurgents reinforce doorways with whatever they can find. Meanwhile, Biden's forces control the Potomac bridges and the key avenues leading to the Capitol. Constitutional Avenue in particular is a blood-soaked stretch of asphalt, with both sides pouring resources into its control. Armored vehicles from the National Guard slowly move down its length, facing waves of gunfire and Molotov cocktails. Civilians caught in the crossfire flee in terror, their homes turned into battlegrounds. The Potomac River itself becomes a critical dividing line. Whoever controls the bridges will dictate who can bring reinforcements into the city. But the chaos on the ground doesn't stop there. Throughout the city, militia groups supporting Trump attempt to coordinate their attacks with the formal Red forces. But disorganization reigns. Some groups refuse to take orders, preferring to act on their own, while others launch poorly timed assaults that only serve to weaken the overall Red effort. The militia groups may have numbers, but they lack the training and discipline of the National Guard. Many are gunned down in the streets of DC, their bodies left as grim reminders of the anarchy. It is now clear to the Biden coalition that now is the time to act. Every second they don't take actions, the chances of rescuing the senators become slimmer. At 11:25 p.m., Joe Biden makes his move. From the safety of his bunker in Delaware, he orders the National Guard to storm the Capitol. If Trump's forces get the senators out of DC, it would rally his base and cement his hold on power. A rescue mission is the only hope the senators have. It's a high-risk, high-reward gamble. But Biden had no choice. The National Guard begins its assault. Teams of guardsmen, equipped with riot shields and automatic weapons, storm the Capitol's main entrances. The fight is brutal, with Oath Keepers defending every inch of ground. The hallways become battlegrounds, echoing with the sounds of gunfire, explosion, and the cries of the wounded. Flashbangs are tossed into rooms before the guardsmen enter, hoping to disorient the rioters inside. But the insurgents won't give up easily. They have waited too long for this moment to let it slip away. Outside the Capitol grounds are no better. The National Guard, trying to secure the perimeter, faced constant attacks from Trump's reinforcements. The fighting spills out onto lawns and monuments. Helicopters hover overhead, ready to extract the senators if the National Guard can break through, but the situation remains tense. Any mistake could cost lives. All the while, Biden and his generals are glued to their screens, watching the assault unfold in real time. They know that this is their moment. If they can pull off the rescue, it will be a devastating blow to Trump's forces. But if they fail, the consequences could be dire. Back in the Capitol, the tension reaches a new height. The pro-Trump forces are forced to retreat further and further. Inside the Senate chambers, Enrique Tarrio sets up a livestream that is quickly being watched by hundreds of thousands of viewers. You can barely hear him speak as shots and explosives are heard inside the Senate. He shows the tired faces of tied-up senators, like Mike Pence and Bernie Sanders, directly into the camera. He then speaks directly to Joe Biden. Biden, you traitor. This is on you, not us. You brought this. You can stop this. Stop this assault and the senators will live. But if one soldier sets foot inside the Senate chamber, we will execute all hostages. They are traitors, but they still deserve a fair trial. But if you force our hand, we shall be the deciders of their justice, and we will not hold back. We are ready to die for this cause. We and everyone in here will die for our country, for America. He then waves the camera towards several Proud Boys, all with handguns directly pointed at the hostages. They are only waiting for their boss's command. In Delaware, the Biden coalition is in disarray. Everyone is hastily arguing on what the best next step of action is. They quickly connect Joe Biden on a phone line to the leader of the National Guard forces inside DC. He directly orders the officer not to storm the Senate chambers. This order comes just in time, as only minutes later National Guard units arrive at the entrance to the chamber. Now a tense standoff is in action, as the gunshots and explosions in the Capitol slowly quiet down. Inside the chamber you have Enrique Tarrio live streaming to the whole world, while he repeatedly threatens to kill all senators. On the outside you have the National Guard, standing ready to follow any further order. While the National Guard are in a tense spot, they are trained professionals, unlike the Proud Boys, who stood under immense pressure for over 24 hours now. Inside the Senate chambers, you can see the tension in the air as Enrique Tarrio slowly begins to panic. While the National Guard waits for further commands, one of the Proud Boys guarding the entrance to the Senate makes a crucial mistake. He has his handgun drawn towards the door, ready to shoot if anyone should pass through. Like the other Proud Boys, he's completely on the edge, and as one particularly loud explosion echoes through the Capitol, he slips up and a single bullet leaves the barrel of his gun. The bullet only narrowly avoids the National Guard outside, who quickly return the fire. Now, as the National Guard is firing shots inside the Senate chamber, Enrique Tarrio gives the order. The Proud Boys aim their guns and fire one fatal shot each. Mike Pence, Bernie Sanders, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, and 20 other senators are now dead. People viewing Tarrio's livestream are unsure on what exactly is going on. In the chaos, they barely saw what happened and only got a glimpse of the dead senators as Tarrio dropped the camera, while bullets hail through the room. It is unclear who shot first. Now the Proud Boys all take cover and fire towards the entrance, which quickly gets blown open by the National Guard. Soldiers storm inside and quickly overwhelm the rioters. Enrique Tarrio is shot in the shoulder, but he survives and is taken hostage, like several other high-ranking Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. The National Guard soldiers, upon eliminating the threat from the insurgents, quickly check on the senators. Unfortunately, not one survived, as they all got hit with a single bullet directly to the head. Biden and his advisors are left speechless. It doesn't take long for the National Guard to clear out the Capitol, and by 2 AM it is under their firm control. However, both the fight in DC and the larger conflict aren't over. Both sides are trying their very best to leverage the situation to their control. For both sides, it feels like they lost. While Trump's faction is celebrating the death of the senators, they lost by now iconic figures in the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and co. who stormed the Capitol. Also, their inability to protect the Capitol isn't a sign of great strength either. The Blue faction, on the other hand, has to live with the knowledge that they made a bad call. They could have acted sooner or with more caution. Tensions about Biden's ability to lead begin to rise within his coalition. Both factions managed to use the situation fairly effectively to their advantage through various propaganda channels. Fox News reports on the betrayal of the National Guard, which led to the death of the senators. They mourn the captured and killed insurgents, who are now seen as martyrs. CNN and co. report on the brutal assassination of senators by Trump's forces. They also report on the symbolic victory Biden's forces achieved by reconquering the Capitol. The population is left even more traumatized and divided as the preparations for further conflict continue. The battle for DC is still raging on, with blue forces slowly but steadily retreating. Donald Trump and his forces know that their best chance for victory are swift and hard strikes. They have the advantage on the ground, and the longer the conflict drags on, the more Biden can exploit his advantage in the economy and intelligence field. US Army units begin to mass assemble in many red areas in preparations for a wave of attacks. Soon the red forces will strike again. The success of their attacks will change the fate of America forever. While the battle for Washington DC is still raging on, the red forces have laid their eyes on a new target. They know that quick and decisive strikes are critical to boost their morale and ensure that Trump's administration has a good chance to win. However, blue forces are stronger than anticipated in many areas. They have crushed practically all red resistance in the Pacific states and the Northeast, their two main strongholds. However, one blue state is looking particularly vulnerable: Michigan. Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, has declared her full support for Joe Biden, and the National Guard of Michigan largely follows her orders. However, pro-Trump units within their ranks conduct several small skirmishes. Michigan is a swing state that voted for Donald Trump in 2016. A large chunk of the rural population is in full support of Donald Trump, and cities in Michigan, mainly Detroit, experience guerrilla-style attacks by red militia groups. Michigan is a state with a history of active militia groups like the Wolverine Watchmen. These groups could be key in providing support for an offensive by the red forces. On top of that, the National Guard in Michigan is constantly occupied with fighting small skirmishes, so they struggle to build sufficient defenses. Donald Trump's forces also are in close proximity to Michigan, as both Ohio and Indiana are under their control. On January 10, US Army troops loyal to Donald Trump begin assembling in Ohio and Indiana, close to the Michigan border. They are not tasked with actually starting an offensive themselves, but rather they train and organize local militia groups. These groups are then sent towards Detroit, where they have different small objectives. The goal is not to capture the city directly, but to cause chaos and strain the strength of the National Guard. The US Army doesn't train them in sync, but rather gives small militia units different objectives, like destroying infrastructure, disrupting supply lines, and so on. While the militia groups are covertly moving into Detroit in waves, the battle for DC is still raging on. Right now, it is the only large-scale military confrontation in the US. The whole world is closely watching the events in DC unfold. Whoever will win in DC will most likely gain international support, as the world wants to side with the winning faction. Nobody is even glancing towards Michigan by this point. Across the US, the violence has actually mostly calmed down, at least compared to the first few days. By now, the dividing lines are clearer, and both red and blue forces located in enemy territory wait for a chance to strike, and instead of blindly attacking. By now, rioters on both sides have organized themselves into militia-like groups and their objectives have shifted. Instead of protesting, they now conduct guerrilla warfare-style attacks. This is especially damaging for Biden's coalition, since guerrilla warfare is very effective in cities and he controls many large urban centers across the nation. Trump's control over Washington DC slowly tightens as Biden is struggling to amass troops to send down the city. The main issue is that the blue forces across the nation prepare for a defensive strategy. No governors want to give up crucial units to capture DC, as they would rather protect their states. Biden's Air Force, however, is extremely effective in slowing down any advances by the red forces towards the capital. But after around a week of fighting, it is clear to the Biden coalition that DC is a lost cause. They simply can't match the manpower the army and local militias provide to Donald Trump. However, they found a strategy to turn the fighting in DC into effective propaganda. Trump's units suffer far higher casualties while killing several civilians in the process. Videos out of DC of Trump supporters fighting against residents and the army destroying neighborhoods serve as crucial motivation for the blue forces' morale. While DC is turning into hell, another city is experiencing increased violence: Detroit. By January 20, almost 15,000 red militia units are fighting a guerrilla war in Detroit against the National Guard. The local communities in Detroit suffer heavily as the militia groups are not holding back from attacking them. Thanks to Biden's strong control over intelligence in the nation, his faction is aware about the large number of red forces assembling in Ohio and Indiana. However, they are unaware about the scale on their involvement in the attacks on Detroit. Biden's advisors make the miscalculation that Trump's forces are preparing for an assault towards the northeast. They assume that Trump plans to attack Pennsylvania to then move towards New Jersey and finally New York and Delaware. This move would cut the blue northeast in two and diminish any hopes of winning DC. If the red forces would indeed attempt such an offensive and succeed, they would have practically won the war. Paranoid of this prospect, Biden's forces heavily fortified those areas. They shift their focus from winning in DC towards defending the northeast, a desperate call, but more and more reports about the sheer manpower of the red forces in Ohio and Indiana pour in. A large chunk of Biden's entire forces are assembled in the northeast. Their first line of defense lies between Baltimore and Pittsburgh. Meanwhile, the situation in Detroit is further deteriorating. By the 25th of January, around 25,000 militia units are actively fighting against the National Guard in and around Detroit. This forces Gretchen Whitmer to draw the National Guard in Michigan away from defending the border and towards aiding Detroit. This leaves a critical flank open. By now, 8,000 out of the 10,000 highly trained National Guard units of Michigan are fighting to secure Detroit. On top of that, a large number of blue militia groups are active in Detroit. Plus, the entire industrial output of Detroit is focused on aiding Biden's coalition. This now turns Detroit into an important yet incredibly vulnerable target. On January 26 at 11 p.m., Donald Trump gives the order. His forces are now tasked with first encircling and then capturing Detroit. The first red units to cross the Michigan border are around 800 specially trained Marine Corps units. They quickly establish control over key highways, allowing broader masses of troops to move into Michigan. From Fort Wayne and Toledo, 25,000 US Army units and 10,000 Ohio National Guard units rush into Michigan. Inside Delaware, everybody quickly realizes what's going on. Biden's team panics on how to best respond to the attack and how they can save Michigan. Biden immediately begins appealing to Canada in an attempt to evacuate the Michigan National Guard out of Detroit through Canada. He finds no success as Canada fears the war would spill onto their border. Biden immediately puts significant numbers of the Air Force towards Michigan. Fighter jets, helicopters and swarms of drones engage in fighting with the red forces rapidly approaching Detroit. The army is prepared, however, and their own airplanes and anti-air weapons put up a decent fight. However, the sheer strength of Biden's Air Force slows them down significantly while inflicting heavy casualties. However, it's not enough to save Detroit. Everyone on Biden's inner circle knows that they need to take decisive action now. They're on the path to lose Washington. If they also lose Detroit, the blue morale most likely wouldn't recover. Inside Detroit, the National Guard and blue militias are already exhausted, but they put up heavy resistance. They disperse and engage in guerrilla-style warfare using their knowledge of the city to their advantage. However, it is only a matter of time before Detroit falls. Can Biden's coalition respond in time? Could losing DC and Detroit mean losing the Civil War? Does Biden even have a chance to turn the tide of war back in his favor? So far in this series, we've only looked at the bigger picture. While we will still do so in this video, I want to showcase some more personal stories from Americans fighting in the Civil War. While their thoughts and actions won't change the outcome of the war, their stories showcase how real American people might react to such horrific civil war. I will dedicate one chapter to their stories and insights. Afterwards, we will find out what Biden's plan is to win the Civil War. The following following short stories are not written by me, but by viewers who submitted them via email. There's 5 tales in total, some of them are very short, while others are a little longer. Please let me know in the comments if you enjoyed these stories. Tale 1. By the 7th day of the battle for Detroit, the situation for both sides was desperate. The devastated, poverty-struck neighborhoods straddling 8 Mile Road were especially heavily affected. Their only line of defense was 8 Mile itself, and one of the people defending that road was Sergeant Lucas Sidney Herbert. Age 25, he was born into a privileged family from Ann Arbor and had joined the National Guard to escape from the pressure of military service, as all rich kids do, but was mobilized 10 days earlier to his station in Flint before being hastily moved over to Detroit. Now he was defending Osborne, a small gang-infested neighborhood on the city's east side, and in fact the place where Eminem had grown up. It was separated from the wealthier suburbs in the north by 8 Mile. In the edge of the neighborhood was Connor Creek, found around a single-track railway with a few warehouses. His platoon, Platoon H of Company A of the 1st Battalion of the 125th Infantry Regiment, was assigned to defending this area. It was a tough fight. In front of them, enemy troops relentlessly fired bullets down the M97, which cut through the area. He was in a small sandbags gunner's nest with 2 other men, found on the intersection of Bringard Drive and the M97. In the past few days he'd settled into a circle: fire, duck, rest, fire. It had repeated relentlessly, and while he was ducking or resting, the 2 other men in his nest fired instead. But that day he got an order from National Guard headquarters: attack the enemy lines. It was a counteroffensive, and he was obliged to join it. Lucas wasn't sure how to do it, but as the enemy machine guns quieted down, he grabbed his M4A1 and began climbing over the sandbags. Both of his comrades in the gunner's nest pleaded for him to not risk his safety, but he ignored them. He jumped over the very top and began running. Initially it was quiet. He ran some 60 yards before he heard machine gun fire. A few bullets narrowly missed him before he stopped to duck behind a truck on the side of the road. The bullets sliced through its doors and windows, shattering the glass and sending it barreling towards him. Lucas grasped his gun tightly to reassure himself. The fire quieted down as the enemy troops reloaded their machine guns. He then jumped around the truck, running further towards their lines, passing the intersection of Coleman Drive and the M97 and arriving at the enemy lines. Lucas broke through the sandbag wall around the lines, tearing through the barbed wire with his feet, leaving scars across his body. He relentlessly fired at the Reds. One fell down almost immediately, the other struggled for his life, and another fled. Eventually, he managed to knock over the mounted machine gun before he was shot in the leg. He fell down on the ground in pain. His 2 comrades quickly got to him and took him to the makeshift field hospital found at the nearby Fisher Magnet Academy. A few hours later, an air raid, one of many, flew over the city, and it happened to strike Fisher Magnet. Lucas died in immense pain as the hospital burned to the ground. Maybe it was a fitting sacrifice if it meant keeping the army at bay for at least a few days. Tale 2 by Changes Alone Endure. This short story is a final letter from Frederick Warren, a 40-year-old veteran who was working as a gravedigger at Woodlawn Cemetery when the Civil War broke out. Although not stated in the letter, he is staying to protect the graves around him, including that of Rosa Parks, due to a rumor on Twitter where white supremacists claim that her body will be used as an example of something once captured. Alexandra, I have thought long about what I was going to write to you. Sergeant Pepper says the treacherous Marines have crossed into the cemetery and that they are only half an hour or so away from our positions at the Rosa Parks Freedom Chapel. We are split too thin, and Pepper has demanded that some volunteers blow up 8 Mile and Woodward Avenue section, while others guard the chapel against looters and traitors. Both are a suicide mission, and Sven and I have signed up for the latter. Since the phone lines are too compromised, Pepper has asked us to write our final letters the old-fashioned way. I know what you're doing, shaking your head, tears flowing out of those precious sea-green eyes and screaming why to the winds. Please do not worry about me, as much as you can. Tell Amia and Penelope that I love them with all my heart. They are the sunshine and the air that I feel and breathe in these harrowing moments. The strength of 1,000 men could not compare to the love I have for my family. In the 20 years we have been married, you know this has always been how I would go out. I was never one for a quiet ending, was I? From Iraq to Afghanistan I have fought enemies on all sides. But now, even when surrounded by the dead, I have never felt more alive. You are the finest of women and the bravest of souls. If I am to die, then my final thoughts will be of us. As I breathe my last, I will imagine your scrappy sunflower dress and sweet smile under the beauty of the stars as our kiss showed me life. Out of all my accomplishments and desires, my greatest was getting the chance to love you. I love you, Alexandra May, in this world and the next. Your loving husband, Frederick. Tale 3 by It's Orlov. Diary of 2nd Lieutenant Jason Richards, U.S. Army soldier, Battle of Detroit. We've got Detroit surrounded, but Biden's forces refuse to quit. It's like Stalingrad out here, street by street, floor by floor, fighting over rubble. The city's burning, buildings crumbling, and the air's thick with smoke. We take ground during the day, but by night they push us back. Supplies are running low, and the enemy snipers pick us off every chance they get. It's brutal, like fighting ghosts. We were all Americans once, but now it's a blood feud. I don't know how much longer they can hold out, but it feels like the city is going to swallow us all. The following is an interview segment with a pro-democracy Black Bloc protester in Detroit, several days into the fighting in the city. The media, whenever they can report, they talk all about the National Guardsmen and the army, the soldiers, the bombing runs, the maneuvers and encirclements, the tanks. That's all they talk about nowadays. I can't really blame them, because I mean, it's not every day you see soldiers, real soldiers, fighting on American soil. But, like, there's still the whole other side of the war that they just stop talking about as often. It's our war, the civilian war, because we're at war too. I mean that completely, literally. We're out there killing each other in the streets just as much as the soldiers are. Wherever the soldiers aren't, that's where we are. And that's where the real psychos are too. Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and any of the hundreds of militias that sprung up over the past few weeks. And they're not trained, not really. I mean, we'd make fun of these guys online for the longest time, but they genuinely don't care if they die. I read about this kind of mentality for ISIS fighters, and seeing it here is just crazy. There's not that much cohesion once the shooting starts, and most organization is ad hoc, leaders shouting and screaming to stay organized. They'll throw bombs, they'll shoot, and we shoot back, and if we run out of ammo we start throwing shit at each other. And when there's nothing left to throw, it turns into a melee. Clubs, knives, machetes, bats. There's no rules of engagement because we're not soldiers, we're just people trying to kill each other by any means necessary. Tale 5. Our battalion received intelligence that the National Guard in Detroit was considering water evacuation up the St. Clair River via commercial vessels to join forces with Minnesota's National Guard. My team had been hiding on a private yacht off Belly Isle for over 12 hours, awaiting instructions. The evacuation faced a challenge. Parts of the St. Clair River were frozen. We learned from pro-Trump sympathizers about 2 Coast Guard tugboats nearby, one on Belle Isle and another across the Detroit River, preparing to break ice at dawn. Our mission: render both tugboats inoperable to halt the evacuation. For the Belle Isle boat, we planned to neutralize the crew on board, improving our chances of successfully exfiltrating on our yacht. The other boat required a different approach. The 2 SARC on the team would dive to plant limited mines on its hull. Maintaining secrecy was crucial, as the Coast Guard neutral reputation meant news of our operation could harm the pro-Trump's coalition's public appeal. We hoped Detroit's gunfire would mask the underwater explosions. The rest of the team left the yacht in the concealment of night across the virtually empty island. A technician briefed us SARC on planting and arming the limited mines. Our task: dive across the Detroit River, reach the tugboat at the Coast Guard station, plant and arm the mines, then dive a mile downstreams to where the yacht will be. As we began our cold dive through the Detroit River, we reached the Detroit side and followed the bank to the boatyard. I unclipped the mine from the keeper plate, and it magnetically locked onto the ship's hull. My fellow SARC approached from under the boat, signaling he had started the delayed fuse on the opposite side. I immediately set my timer and hurriedly dove away downstream. After diving downstream for what seemed like an eternity, we finally boarded the yacht, relieved to see that the rest of our team had also made it out. As we were taking off our diving suits, we heard the mines detonate amidst gunfire. Mission successful. I hope these 5 short stories gave you a glimpse into the harsh realities on the ground. While it's intriguing to speculate about grand what-if wars, we must remember that real people endure unimaginable suffering in these scenarios. With that sobering thought, let's turn back to the heart of the Second American Civil War and the battle for Detroit. As of January 30, it appears that Detroit is on the brink of falling entirely under Red control, but Biden still has cards to play. Though the Red forces have encircled Detroit, they've made a critical error. Their flanks in Ohio and Indiana remain exposed. A well-coordinated blue offensive could break the siege and change the tide of the war. Yet, even as Biden's military advisors plot a counterstrike, another piece of advice reaches his ear. Military strength alone won't decide this conflict. Victory will also be determined by perception, both at home and abroad. The battle for Detroit may be fierce, but the most crucial fight could be for the hearts and minds of the people. Winning the propaganda war may be the only path to ultimate victory. With each hour passing, the situation in Detroit is looking more grim for the Blue Forces. They're fighting a guerrilla-style war while the Air Force is tirelessly bombing positions of Trump's army. However, they can't match their sheer numbers of Trump's forces. Trump has around 30,000 professionally trained units in Detroit at this point, while Biden has only around 6,000, all of them being the remaining Michigan National Guard units, who haven't surrendered yet. The situation in DC is looking pretty much the same, arguably even worse. Biden's forces are completely encircled and many of them have already surrendered. The Air Force is still inflicting heavy casualties on Trump's forces, but with each day passing they gain control over another street, block or building. In the so far only 2 major battles of the Second American Civil War, Biden's forces are encircled, tired and on the retreat. This sounds incredibly hopeless for Joe Biden and his faction. However, inside Delaware, nobody has lost hope yet. It has become clear to Biden's faction that Donald Trump and his loyalists are making one crucial mistake. A mistake that might seem insignificant when looking on a map of the frontlands, but a mistake that could shift the tide of war. Donald Trump is failing to effectively utilize propaganda to his advantage. Of course, Trump and his advisors know how important propaganda is in modern conflicts. However, they're playing their cards a little wrong. Trump is focused on creating an image of being the strongman that saves America. He paints his troops as the strong patriots and Biden's troops as the weak enemies of America. His propaganda campaign heavily emphasizes victories achieved by the Red forces, such as the encirclement of Detroit and the almost finished victory in Washington, D.C. However, what his propaganda is not acknowledging is the situation on the ground, and for a good reason. In Detroit especially, blue forces are fighting a guerrilla-style war. This makes it extremely difficult to tell for Trump's forces who is a civilian and who isn't. Even though the Battle of Detroit is not raging on for long now, several red militia units have already committed atrocities against local communities. Especially African-American suburbs of Detroit are suffering. There are several instances of militia units killing civilians seemingly at random because they mistook them for Biden's forces. Also inside Trump militias, several radical racists have mixed themselves amongst the Trump supporters. While the Army and Marine Corps specifically warned the militia groups to not harm civilians, still many hateful attacks in Detroit happen. Imagine reports of teenagers and children being killed by red militants. The Trump administration is largely looking away from these issues, being focused on fully capturing Detroit. They view that capturing the city will result in a propaganda victory that could further push the tide of war in their favor. What they're not realizing is that the attack on Detroit in the first place was a complete blunder from a propaganda perspective. Biden's coalition, with the help of the Air Force, CIA, NSA, and independent journalists, documents the war crimes of Trump's forces. So far, the civil war hasn't even lasted a month. Many Americans are still somewhat undecided or unsure if they're supporting the right side. Many less dedicated Trump supporters begin to question if they're supporting the moral side. In response to the ramped-up propaganda by Biden, red media outlets dismiss the reports, pictures, and videos of the war crimes as fake news. They discredit pictures and videos as being AI-generated, but many Americans can see through their lies. So far, the propaganda war is turning more and more in the favor of Joe Biden. However, that drastically changes at 8 p.m. on February the 3rd. Major General William J. Walker, the general leading the National Guard units in DC, officially surrenders to army units loyal to Trump. He and several hundred other soldiers get taken prisoner and are being transported into Florida, where they will be tried. Now Washington DC lies in Donald Trump's hands once again, although some National Guard units refuse to surrender and continue to fight a covert guerrilla war. This marks a huge propaganda victory for Donald Trump, or at least that's what he initially thought. Headlines in red media outlets preach about the victory in DC and how God is on their side. The Biden coalition, however, was prepared for the eventual fall of DC. While they did not expect General Walker to surrender this soon, they are not completely dumbstruck by the event. Within hours, they pump out a large-scale propaganda campaign depicting atrocities and destruction inside DC. They call for Americans to protest the fascism that has taken over their capital. General Walker is turned into a martyr who fought for the Constitution, liberty, and America. The Biden coalition details reports about Walker and the other captured soldiers being brutally tortured in Florida ahead of the trial. If the reports are true or not is anyone's guess, but they are effectively in further pushing the image of Trump being a villain. This is motivating more and more soldiers to take up arms in support of Joe Biden. But before we continue with how the propaganda is unfolding, we need to look at Biden's next big step. Now, with DC under Trump's grip, it is clear that Biden needs to take decisive actions now. Right now, many blue forces are practically doing nothing in the Northeast. They build defenses in states like Pennsylvania, New York, and Co., only for the red forces to attack Michigan. Now, with the effective propaganda campaign and the fear of being tortured, mock trialed, and executed, the blue forces are extremely motivated to fight. However, Biden needs to truly rally the nation behind the cause of Detroit if he wants to save the city. In the second week of February, Biden's coalition ramps up their propaganda efforts to a new high. Documents and videos of brutal war crimes get shared across the world. Biden holds several speeches calling Detroit the last stand for democracy. Now the stage is set for the March on the Iron City. On February the 5th, the leaders of several blue state governors meet up with Joe Biden and other high-ranking blue military officials. They discuss the logistics and possibilities of a march on Detroit. Joe Biden's Air Force has air superiority over Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. This would allow for the blue forces to march safely, even if they met with larger red numbers than anticipated. The governors, however, are not immediately convinced. They would need to allow Biden to use large numbers of their National Guard units for the offensive. The move could potentially backfire heavily. If the march on Detroit isn't successful, the lack of defending troops in the Northeast could be exploited. Furthermore, it is very difficult for military officials to tell how many more troops Trump will be able to mobilize in the coming weeks and months.
If a good chunk of the National Guard of even only Pennsylvania and New York are occupied in Detroit, Trump might be able to pull off an offensive into Delaware and New York City. This terrifies the governors of said states who would rather wage a defensive war. However, both Joe Biden and his closest advisors know that now is the right time to strike. Trump's forces have left a strategic gap that allows for Biden's forces to push into Michigan. Not abusing that soon could mean losing this strategic advantage. Also, morale in the blue faction is high, as more and more parts of the world begin to view Trump as the villain. On February 8, Joe Biden gives the order. 25,000 National Guard units from various northeastern states breached the border between Ohio and Pennsylvania, shortly before the Air Force bombed defensive positions along the border. The Ohio National Guard is completely overwhelmed, as they didn't expect such a strong attack this soon. However, they put up a strong fight, and even with the support of the Air Force, the blue advance is slower than anticipated. No matter where blue units are passing through, they're met with ambushes and guerrilla-style attacks. They're mostly moving along Lake Erie, as their goal is not to occupy Ohio but to reach Detroit quickly. Inside Mar-a-Lago, panic is ensuing. Trump's advisors didn't expect such a strong attack this soon. Of course, a counteroffensive was anticipated, but later and with a smaller force. Shortly after the breach into Ohio, Trump meets with the governors of Texas, Florida, Georgia, and a few more red states. Their National Guard units have already defeated most of the resistance inside bigger cities like Miami, Houston, or Atlanta. Both in Florida and Texas, they begin to assemble alongside Army and Marine Corps units. In total, just 48 hours after the breach, Trump's faction has already mobilized 50,000 soldiers ready to march north. Of course, Biden has caught wind of this, and it's becoming clear to him and his coalition that the battle for Detroit will be a deciding factor in winning the war. Whoever can aid the city better will gain the clear upper hand. Biden's forces move towards Detroit sluggishly but steadily. They reach the outskirts of the city on February 11, 3 days after crossing into Ohio. 4 p.m. on February 11, the first battle between National Guard units of New York and pro-Trump Army units breaks out in the outskirts of Detroit. Within the next hour, several similar battles break out in the southern side. While this was completely expected, the tensions about the new escalation is felt around the whole world. Within less than 24 hours, the soldiers sent by Biden managed to connect with some of the National Guard units from Michigan. This is a crucial advantage now, as the National Guard of Michigan has experience in how to deal with the Red forces in Detroit. While Biden's forces only connected with a small support battalion of about 250 soldiers, it is still a significant early achievement, not only because the soldiers can share their experience on the ground with the arriving forces, but also because it gives a crucial motivation to other pro-Biden forces still trapped inside Detroit. Their situation seemed almost hopeless a day ago, and now the prospects of holding Detroit and defeating the Red forces are in reach. Both Joe Biden and Donald Trump have their eyes glued on Detroit. They get briefed about virtually every minor troop movement. However, slowly their attention inside Delaware shifts towards another issue. On February 16, the CIA reports that there are clear signs that Russia is preparing to send aids towards Donald Trump. This is the first time since the beginning of the conflict that a foreign nation is beginning to directly involve itself, besides humanitarian aid. Only a day later, the NSA, which is working for Joe Biden, manages to intercept several conversations between some Trump advisors and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. In the intercepted talks, there are mentions about sending a large scale of aid to Donald Trump in exchange for Trump to abandon NATO and the European Union. According to the interception, Putin is ready to send Trump a significant amount of aid, mainly guns, ammunitions, but even some tanks and airplanes. Also, Lavrov promised the Russian mercenary force Wagner will send 5,000 of their soldiers to help in Detroit. Yes, you have heard me correctly at the end here. Putin is willing to send 5,000 soldiers. Why would he do that? Would 5,000 soldiers even make a difference? Why on earth would Putin be willing to send Wagner forces to America? Well, he directly instructed Lavrov to negotiate a deal with Donald Trump. Russian intelligence estimates that Trump will win the conflict. Right now, most of the world actually believes so, as he has managed to push Biden out of DC and mobilize a way larger number of soldiers. As we all know, Putin is very interested in Ukraine and Eastern Europe in general. In 2021, he hasn't launched his invasion, and Europe and the world don't know about his plans yet. For that reason, Putin is willing to send Trump a significant amount of aid in exchange for Trump to leave NATO and abandon Europe. Putin instructed Lavrov that if Trump doesn't take the deal, he can on top promise 5,000 Wagner soldiers. Thanks to the clever negotiation tactics of Trump's advisors, Lavrov presented them with the Wagner proposal, which they immediately took. While 5,000 soldiers sound pretty insignificant, they would actually make quite a difference. Firstly, just because the Army and Marine Corps are loyal to Trump, that doesn't mean they are willing to fight offensively for him. The same goes for many National Guard units. Right now, most soldiers in the US are not fighting inside Detroit, but rather are protecting their home states and are fighting against skirmishes and guerrilla attacks by the opposing side. The map I'm always showing is showing which state is aligned to which side, but it's not meant to show the complete front line. Trump at this point in time has mobilized 50,000 soldiers ready to be sent to Detroit. He is trying to get as many troops as possible, as he knows that Biden's Air Force will inflict heavy casualties on his forces. Besides that, Wagner soldiers are very well trained in asymmetrical warfare, which is crucial in Detroit. Also, simply the fact that a highly trained foreign force is joining Trump's side will give his troops a morale boost and could be used as effective propaganda. The CIA leaks these informations to the world on February 19. In response, many Western nations vowed
to strengthen their foreign aid to Joe Biden. The invisible red line of sending military aid is now broken. Most European nations quickly begin preparing small to medium weapons packages, with Germany initially only sending helmets. But right now, the most important nation is Canada. Its military vowed to help the US Navy to protect US coastlines and intercept any weapon shipments to Trump. They also quickly provide Biden with military intel, which is especially useful in Michigan and Detroit, which lie right on the border to Canada. However, they still don't allow troop movements through their borders. On February 21, another escalation occurs. A freight ship disguised as a humanitarian aid shipment from Italy is intercepted by the US Navy in the Gulf of Mexico. On board the ship, the Navy finds around 2,000 assault rifles alongside 50,000 bullets, 50 grenade launchers, and some light anti-air weapons. The shipment, of course, is from Russia. In response, the Navy ramps up their patrolling efforts and they intercept several more shipments in the Gulf of Mexico, Atlantic, and even the Pacific. Within a few days, Putin pulls a halt to the shipments as over 80% of them got intercepted. This is another victory for the Biden faction. While the amount of equipment seized truly is useful, it won't change the tide of the war. However, the propaganda implications are significant. Trump expected to have a propaganda victory by getting foreign military aid first. However, now it is clear that he doesn't even have the capabilities to receive large numbers of foreign aid, while Biden theoretically can receive an unlimited amount. For many loyal to Trump, it feels like they're encircled by Biden, as Canada and the Navy won't let anything pass through towards them. However, there's one faction bordering the US that doesn't care too much about the outcome of the conflict, but rather about making a fortune: the Mexican cartels. Trump and Putin strategically negotiate with the cartels, and they allow for Russia to send foreign aid towards Texas through their territories. The cartels even help with transporting shipments. Through this way, 5,000 Wagner soldiers make their way into Texas on February 24. They quickly join with the mobilized troops there. By now, Trump has amassed 60,000 soldiers, and with the Wagner mercenaries, 65,000 well-trained soldiers are ready to make their way towards Detroit. On top of that, another 50,000 militia units are ready to follow them behind. Of course, Joe Biden and his faction know about these large troop numbers and have made efforts to mobilize their own forces. So far, they've mobilized about 20,000 well-trained units with an additional 10,000 militia troops. Nothing compared to Trump's numbers. However, not all hope is lost for Biden, as he still has the Air Force and Navy on his side. 2 days after the arrival of the Wagner troops on February 26, Donald Trump gives the order for all mobilized units to move into Michigan and Detroit. Currently, around 20,000 well-trained pro-Trump soldiers are battling 27,000 pro-Biden forces in Detroit. After nearly a month of intense fighting, both sides have suffered heavy casualties. Thousands of pro-Biden protesters, militia groups, and local resistance fighters have been killed, along with over 10,000 pro-Trump militia members and about 5,000 Army and Marine Corps troops. Biden's forces have lost 2,000 highly trained soldiers. Despite this, Biden holds the advantage with slightly more well-trained units, complete air superiority, and a far better intelligence over the city. Trump, however, still commands around 30,000 militia fighters. As it stands, Biden is dominating the battle in Detroit. Almost none of the Michigan National Guard units who fought since day one in Detroit are now encircled. Most of Trump's forces by now have retreated to the north of the city. However, a large chunk of the militia units are still trying their best to fight a guerrilla-style war. However, most of their attempts fail as the Air Force is patrolling the sky 24/7. This dynamic, however, will change very soon. Inside Delaware, Biden is made aware about the movement of Trump's forces from Florida and Texas. He orders the Air Force to conduct strikes on the moving soldiers. Just a few days ago, he ordered his 20,000 newly mobilized soldiers to fortify his supply lines towards Detroit. If Trump's forces manage to cut Detroit off, that would be the end of the city. The 20,000 soldiers fortify Ann Arbor, Toledo, Cleveland, and the highways and other smaller strategic points along the supply line. Biden's advisors expect that around half of 65,000 Trump soldiers are tasked with destroying the supply link between the Northeast and Detroit, and the other with reinforcing and then capturing Detroit. As Biden's advisors expected, 35,000 of Trump's forces, including the 5,000 Wagner soldiers, moved directly into northern Detroit, while the remaining 30,000 are more split up and attack along the supply line. They mainly focus on Toledo as it is the weak point of the defense. While Biden's forces in Toledo are outnumbered 1-3, with the Air Force flying overhead constantly, Trump's forces make practically no advances into Toledo. Biden's supply lines stand firm so far. In Detroit, the situation is shifting though. Now Trump has 55,000 units standing against Biden's 27,000. On top of that, Trump's units are highly trained in urban combat and not exhausted, unlike Biden's forces. Trump's forces slowly capture block after block, street after street, on their way towards Detroit Metropolitan Wayne County Airport. This airport is the base of operations for many planes of the Air Force conducting strikes against Trump units. All blue forces have the task to protect it. It is the highest priority target. Of course, Trump's units also make their way towards downtown Detroit. This is also where the majority of the Wagner soldiers are operating. Now, as slowly all of Trump's forces are pouring into the city, the fighting is truly escalating. Every high building is used by snipers, and the sounds of gunshots, explosions, and airplanes are constant. Small drones are soaring through the skies, dropping explosives into tanks and buildings. Armored vehicles are filling the streets of downtown Detroit, while the images of Detroit
before the fight in DC were shocking. Americans and the world hold their breaths as the images of the fighting in Detroit reach global headlines. Biden's forces have the clear disadvantage and they are retreating at a similar pace as in DC. The Marine Corps are highly trained in urban warfare, and by now they have figured out how to effectively use Detroit's dense urban areas and industry to minimize the danger of Biden's forces. However, the propaganda war Biden is waging is becoming more effective with every new image of the destruction in Detroit. Residents inside Detroit put up heavy resistance against Trump's units, especially the super violent militia groups. However, that is still not enough to stop the slow but steady advance of Trump's units. Inside Delaware, everyone knows they need a change of strategy. Biden's military advisors brief him that there is virtually no way to win the ground war in the city. They need to besiege Trump's troops and cut off their supplies. The Air Force is largely redirected towards striking supply lines and infrastructure hubs the Red forces used to supply their troops in Detroit. Initially, this gives the Red forces an advantage as they are now able to move quicker through Detroit than before. By March 10, Trump's forces have pushed the majority of Biden's forces out of central Detroit. Now much of the fighting is in the suburbs. On the same day, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, visits Delaware. He is discussing with Biden the possibility to deploy 9,000 California National Guard units to aid Michigan. California so far has been largely left out of the fighting. Only local militia groups have caused the state trouble, but even 1/4 of the current National Guard would easily be able to handle them. So Gavin Newsom is willing to send half his National Guard to aid Biden's effort. March 11 marks a pivotal and bloodier shift in the battle for Detroit. Biden's Air Force intensifies its relentless strikes on Trump's supply lines with devastating results. Key highways, bridges, and railings feeding the Red forces are obliterated, leaving thousands of Trump's troops stranded without reinforcements. The Blue forces have been slowly retreating from downtown Detroit, but this strategic withdrawal buys them valuable time to fortify the suburbs and regroup for a final counteroffensive. By now, both sides have endured staggering losses. Civilians caught in the crossfire add to the growing death toll, with residential districts in ruins. Entire blocks are leveled by airstrikes, artillery, and brutal street fighting. Biden's forces, hardened and exhausted, dig in across Detroit's outer neighborhoods, knowing they must hold the line while Gavin Newsom's 9,000 California National Guard troops make their way to reinforce them. Combined with Biden's garrisons in Toledo, the Blue forces managed to secure their critical supply route, despite repeated assaults from Trump's militias, who pay for every advance with heavy casualties. By March 19, the news tightens around Trump's forces. His 50,000 troops, including the hardened Wagner soldiers, find themselves running dangerously low on supplies. The morale of the pro-Trump militias begins to crack as rumors of dwindling ammunition spread through their ranks. With their offensive slowing, the Red forces are further crippled by Biden's strategic airstrikes on the remaining fuel deposits and ammunition caches in the northern suburbs. In Detroit, the situation becomes catastrophic. Block by block, the once dominant Trump forces, now critically short on fuel, ammo, and reinforcements, lose their grip on the city. With armored vehicles immobilized and infantry units scrambling to salvage what little remains, the urban battlefield becomes a nightmarish graveyard of burned-out tanks and shattered buildings. The death tolls now on both sides rises to tens of thousands, but it's Trump's forces that bear the brunt of this hellish attrition. On March 24, Biden's forces, bolstered by Newsom's fresh National Guard troops, launch a desperate counteroffensive under the cover of night. Elite units retake strategic points in northern Detroit, while exhausted Red forces, besieged and outgunned, struggle to respond. The ambushes are merciless. Buildings rigged with explosives collapse on advancing Trump militias. Trump's guerrilla tactics, once feared, now crumble without the supply to sustain them. Facing the onslaught, Trump orders a final all-out assault on Detroit Metropolitan Wayne County Airport, a last-ditch attempt to turn the tide, but the Blue forces are ready. Biden's Air Force continues its relentless bombardment, cutting through Trump's armored columns as they push towards the airport. In one particularly brutal engagement, hundreds of Trump's soldiers perish in an ambush that leaves the streets littered with wrecked vehicles and bodies. And by March 30, Trump's forces are trapped. Halted by Biden's fortified suburban defenses and under constant aerial assault, they find themselves with no way out. With food, fuel, and ammunition almost entirely depleted, Trump's commanders are left with no choice but to negotiate terms of surrender. Entire battalions lay down their arms, with over 20,000 pro-Trump fighters captured or killed in the final days. The streets, once a fierce battleground, falls silent, but for the distant hum of drones circling overhead. On the 2nd of April, Biden declares victory in Detroit from his Delaware stronghold. The cost has been immense, he acknowledges in his speech to the nation. But today we have turned the tide. Across the shattered remnants of Detroit, residents emerge from their ruins. Their city, battered but free from Trump's forces. The battle for Detroit, America's Stalingrad, has claimed tens of thousands of lives and left the city in ruins. Yet for Biden and his forces, it marks a decisive and brutal victory, one that shifts the momentum of the entire war. Before we dive into how the Civil War continues, let us quickly look at the death tolls. From the 55,000 well-trained soldiers Trump sent, 35,000 were killed in combat. Nearly 5,000 of those casualties are the Wagner soldiers, from whom almost all perished. On top, Trump had a substantive amount of militia units in Detroit. Their death tolls are even higher, with around 40,000 total deaths.
From the Michigan National Guard present in Detroit since the beginning, 7,000 soldiers have died. From Biden's initial force of 27,000 soldiers, 10,000 have died, combined with another 2,000 California National Guard casualties. This puts Biden's well-trained soldier casualties at roughly 19,000. Also on his side though were a substantive number of local resistance fighters who played a crucial role, especially in the early stages of the battle. They make up for another 10,000 casualties. We also can't forget the civilian casualties, which are around 25,000. All in total, this puts the casualties in the Battle of Detroit to 139,000. Of course, this number is nowhere near the death tolls of Stalingrad, which had around 2 million casualties. However, if you consider that the Battle of Detroit lasted less than 2 months, the scale of destruction becomes apparent. Now with both the battle for DC and Detroit over, everyone is waiting for Donald Trump to respond. Can the Red Forces recover from this devastating loss? And how will the world react as the echoes from Detroit reach their ears? Media outlets all around the world and many inside the US compare the Battle of Detroit to the Battle of Stalingrad. Western world leaders are pleading to Donald Trump to lay down their arms. The Biden coalition is celebrating their victory with caution. They've proven that the Trump administration's greatest strength, their manpower, can compete with their air force, intelligence and high morale. With Detroit now firmly in their hands, Biden also has a decent lead when it comes to military production output. While it is true that the majority of raw resources still lie in Trump's hand, the majority of heavy factories are under Biden's control. For every bullet the Trump administration produces, Biden's coalition can produce 2. On top of that, the Navy is blocking any weapon shipments meant for Trump, while the blue states get constant shipments of equipment from the EU, UK, Japan, South Korea and co. Also, the factories under Biden's control are far safer. Thanks to the Air Force, Biden has the power to bombard infrastructure, factories, supply hubs and co. all over the continental US. With the Air Force now largely free after the Battle of Detroit, they immediately begin attacking Red military infrastructure. Their main targets are facilities in Texas and Florida, as those are the Red strongholds. Cities with military and heavy industry controlled by Trump experience constant air raids terrorizing the local citizens. The cities hit the hardest are Houston, Dallas, Phoenix and Huntsville in Alabama. The Red Forces are now completely on the defense. Inside Mar-a-Lago, all hell is breaking loose. The Trump administration tries their best to turn the bombing runs into a propaganda campaign, claiming that Biden is killing civilians at will. However, it is not very effective, as many have been convinced that Trump is the villain in this. His public support by now is noticeably lower than Biden's. Inside the Army and Marine Corps, mutinies become more common, further straining Red morale. By March 8, or a week after the loss in Detroit, Trump makes yet another drastic decision. He knows he needs to act, as his chances of winning are dwindling with every day. Trump orders for all available troops to assemble in Arizona, close to the California border. California for now has been largely left untouched by the Red Forces. While militia groups cause trouble, especially in the western regions, California has been considered to be a safe haven. Cities like LA, San Francisco, San Diego and co. have been able to produce a large amount of ammunition and equipment for the Biden coalition. On top of that, air bases inside California have been used in the last week to target cities like Phoenix, Houston and Dallas. Trump knows that he needs to pull off a big victory now. He needs a critical morale boost to keep the Army and Marine Corps loyal. If this move fails, it would certainly mean the end for Trump sooner or later. By March 10, 7,500 soldiers have assembled in Arizona, willing to march into California. While it's a decent force, even without the units that fought in Detroit, California has 9,000 National Guard units ready at their disposal. On top of that, they've set up many defensive positions, making an assault into California very difficult. Practically all of Trump's military advisors urge him that attacking California is a terrible idea. However, Trump isn't backing down, and the relation between him and the army further strains. Some battalions begin to flat out refuse to shoot at Biden militias unless they're attacked first. Many red state governors now begin to realize the situation they're in. They've supported the side who's now on the losing path. The governors of Georgia and North Carolina secretly begin negotiations with the Biden coalition. However, most other red state governors chose a different path. They double down and begin sending many of their National Guard troops to Arizona in an attempt to muster up a large army. Within a single week, 45,000 highly trained National Guard units from various red states make their way towards Arizona. The red states just left enough troops behind to ensure they could defeat themselves for a decent amount of time. In a war where every soldier is mobilized and ready to go all out, this would be a devastating loss. However, in Detroit it became clear that Biden doesn't have the capabilities to mobilize large armies ready to capture entire states. Instead, he needs to focus his forces on single, highly important targets like Detroit. Of course, an army of 50,000 soldiers could easily overwhelm the California National Guard, but the Biden coalition hasn't turned a blind eye. Let's quickly catch up to what they've been planning, besides air campaigns. Shortly after Trump began to mobilize units in Arizona, the Biden coalition caught wind of it. However, they're not entirely sure what his plan is. At first, the assumption was that Trump actually plans to attack air bases in New Mexico to fight back against the air raids. Nobody in Delaware expected Trump to be bold enough to attack California with 7,500 soldiers. Of course, with the National Guard units, he now has almost 60,000. From the 9,000 National Guard units California sent to Detroit, 5,000 are still ready to fight. Those units of course immediately return back to California to help in defensive preparations. On top of that, Biden sends 5,000 troops from the Detroit force to California and New Mexico each. California now holds 19,000 troops ready to defend the state. They have also set up defensive positions and hold an extensive amount of the Air Force. On March 14, Donald Trump gives the order. 57,500 soldiers cross into California, ready to give their lives to win the Civil War. Their target is to capture San Diego and then move north towards LA and Palm Springs. This attack will decide the war. If Trump doesn't manage to bring California to its knees, he will lose the war. The crusade into California has begun. The Red forces immediately encounter issues. The Air Force has been ready, and the moment the troops cross the border, they begin an all-out assault. Biden's coalition has learned how the Trump administration wages war. They know they will win in the long run if they manage to hold back the initial wave. Now they know that they can't compete for every meter of land, but need to strategically retreat first. Mere minutes after Trump gave the order, several bombers, helicopters, fighter planes and drones moved from various air bases towards Arizona. Instead of targeting the attacking force, they focused their firepower on supply chains and support companies. Missiles and bombs rained down on oil depots, highways, train lines and support battalions in Arizona. The strike was a success, and only hours after the attack started, the Red forces already lost a significant amount of their supply capabilities. To further strain their resources, Biden orders the 5,000 soldiers tasked with defending New Mexico to move into Arizona. Their goal is to blockade highways, railways and other connecting points between Arizona and the rest of the Red states. With this move, they ensure that the soldiers marching into California are now left without any backup. They are now practically encircled, and the only direction they can go is forward. The Red soldiers push hard towards San Diego, but are met with fierce resistance by the California National Guard. The Blue forces tactically retreat several times to conduct ambushes in strategic positions. They had at least some time to prepare after all. This puts a heavy strain on the Red forces, who become more desperate with every hour passing. They are making strong advances, but with every new ambush, their casualties stack further. On March 16, 52,000 of the initial 57,500 soldiers reach the outskirts of San Diego. The city is prepared, however, and the Blue forces begin to dig in, ready to defend the city. The Air Force now is also ready, again, to strike at Trump's forces directly, and with no supplies being able to come to their aid, the 52,000 Red soldiers are practically trapped. 2 hours after they breach the first suburbs of San Diego, the Air Force begins the next all-out assault. Planes, helicopters and drones from all over California roar over the soldiers, dropping countless bombs and missiles on the sitting ducks. Meanwhile, the 5,000 Blue soldiers in Arizona have managed to keep their supply blockade up. The remaining soldiers of the Arizona National Guard are attacking their positions, but with the Air Force's support, the Blue blockade holds. The Red forces in California are still making steady progress, but their casualties are skyrocketing. By the time they reach the actual city lines of San Diego on March 18, only 40,000 soldiers remain. Also, the further they move into the urban areas, the more of a local resistance they are facing. Many residents of San Diego organize into militias to fight alongside the California National Guard to protect their city from the Red Terror. On March 19, nothing much changes about the situation. The Red forces push further while still suffering heavy casualties. However, somewhere else a significant turn of event occurs. The governors of Georgia and North Carolina, formerly red states, declared their neutrality, and in separate speeches both accept Joe Biden as the rightful president. They also vowed to not intervene in the fighting in any way from now on. They did so in return for legal immunity once the Civil War is over. To both of them it is clear that Trump can't win. This turn of events is a significant morale loss for Trump's forces and a big victory for Biden. The soldiers in California and Arizona feel like they're finishing off from what's left of the Red forces. Only a day later, several red state governors secretly make their way towards Delaware to negotiate similar deals. On March 22, the states of Utah, Indiana, Montana and Arizona also declared their neutrality. Now the 5,000 Blue soldiers in Arizona are free, as they no longer need to blockade supply movements. It's now clear to the world that Trump has lost the Civil War. However, the war still isn't over, and every decision made now by either side will still have a significant impact on the future of America and the world. With the 5,000 soldiers moving in from Arizona, the remaining 30,000 Red forces in California slowly begin to surrender. Battalion after battalion lay down their arms. The news of the surrenders quickly reached both Delaware and Mar-a-Lago. A day after the surrenders, several more states followed the lead of Georgia and North Carolina. Shortly after, Trump, in companion with Ron DeSantis, declared in a televised address that they, true patriots, won't stand down. Florida will remain resistant no matter if other states bow down to Biden. Trump calls several governors cowards and traitors by name and calls for any patriotic American anyone living in a blue or neutral state to take up arms and fight for America. This ignites a new wave of militia attacks, especially in states that declared their neutrality. However, not nearly enough to shift the direction of the war in any significant direction. On March 27 at 11 p.m., Biden orders Operation Eclipse. It's a top secret plan that him and his advisors came up with during the earlier stages of the war. Trump's estate in Mar-a-Lago isn't perfectly defended, and with a coordinated assault they could manage to capture Trump. Now with no real big obstacles in the way, Biden gives the green light for the operation. 2 airborne and 3 seaborne battalions make their landings on March 28 at 2 a.m. in the cover of darkness. They're supported by several Navy and Air Force units ready to be deployed. An hour earlier, several battalions, in total about 3,000 soldiers, breached the border into Florida from Georgia in an attempt to draw the Florida National Guard away from Mar-a-Lago. The airborne units paratroop into the surrounding areas while the seaborne units land on the shore close by. They quickly surround Mar-a-Lago without being noticed yet. Then the assault begins. The units attack the perimeter, being met with a smaller force than expected. The defending Red Forces consist of about 900 Secret Service members, alongside roughly 400 National Guard units from Florida. Still, they are no match for the 5 attacking battalions. The Blue Forces slowly push towards Mar-a-Lago. In a panic, while the fighting outside his estate is raging on, Trump orders his staff to evacuate him in a helicopter. What they don't know is that several drones are monitoring the building from above. As the staff readies the helicopter, 2 precision missiles are fired from the drones, destroying the helicopter immediately. Trump was standing too far away to be hit, but he's now trapped. His forces barricade him in Mar-a-Lago, but everyone knows that their time has come. Within 2 hours, the blue battalions reach the estate and make their way inside. They're still being met with fierce resistance, but one after the other they take the Secret Service agents out. At 6 a.m. on March 28, Biden's battalions breach the bunker room Trump was hiding in. Trump and several of his staff members, including Ron DeSantis, get arrested. They immediately get flown into Delaware. On 7:42 a.m., Biden officially announces the capture of Trump and Ron DeSantis in a press conference. This marks the time the Civil War is officially over. In many cities, even in red states, many people go to the streets in celebrations. Of course, not all the violence has stopped, with many militia groups still conducting guerrilla attacks. However, no pro-Trump professional army is still actively fighting, as all remaining states have declared to rejoin Biden's America. Can America heal from the war? What is its position in the international community now? As celebrations erupted in cities from Seattle to Miami, a stark contrast played out in the shadows. The remnants of the Civil War lingered in the hearts and minds of millions. In the weeks following March 28, Biden's administration faced the monumental task of uniting a fractured nation. While the official fighting had ceased, the ideological rift that had led to the war remained wide and deep. On April 1st, Biden addressed the nation from the White, urging unity and healing. "We are not blue states or red states," he declared, "but the United States of America. It's time to come together, not as adversaries, but as neighbors, as friends, and as one people." The address resonated with many, igniting hope for a fresh start. Yet the celebrations were met with resistance from die-hard Trump supporters. Many victory parades and celebrations get caught up in the violence by Trump supporters. Biden's administration faced increasing pressure to address the discontent without further inflaming tensions. Meanwhile, in Mar-a-Lago, the once opulent estate is now a partly destroyed mansion, a stark symbol of the power lost. Trump and DeSantis, along with other prominent figures, were held in a maximum security facility in Delaware, awaiting trial for their roles in the uprising. Trump, once a dominant force in American politics, now found himself isolated, grappling with the consequences of his actions, while his followers clung to a hope for a comeback. On April 10, the official trials of Trump and several advisors, military official and red state governors who haven't declared their neutrality begins. The trials are being held inside Detroit to honor the city's importance in the war. Media outlets around the world compare the trials to the Nuremberg trials. Back on the ground, citizens face the grim realities of a nation healing from deep wounds. Economies in several states had collapsed during the conflict, leaving countless people unemployed and desperate. Biden's administration rolled out a comprehensive recovery plan focusing on infrastructure, job creation, and mental health support. Community centers were established across the nation to aid those grappling with trauma from the war. Programs aimed at reconciliation and understanding were initiated, encouraging dialogue between divided communities. However, only time will tell how effective these measures will be. Internationally, the United States faced skepticism. Allies questioned the nation's ability, while adversaries saw an opportunity to exploit the chaos. Leaders around the world watched closely as Biden worked to restore America's standing. The administration sought to reaffirm alliances and strengthen international partnership, emphasizing a commitment to democracy and human rights. On May 24 of 2021, Putin, now already more isolated on the world stage because of Wagner's involvement in the civil war, decided that now is his time to shine. Tanks and armored vehicles roll into Ukraine, similarly to our time. This time, however, America isn't able to provide nearly as much support. Yet, the Ukrainian resistance, with a more aware and self-centered Europe, is still very strong. The Second American Civil War, in combination with the attack on Ukraine, truly finished off any international hope for a peaceful future. Europe is rearming itself in the desperate attempt to support support Ukraine against Russian aggression. Without the strong deterrence of the US, many nations fear that a large-scale conflict, or even World War III, is inevitable. However, Biden is still trying his hardest to heal the wounds inside his nation, also works around the clock to re-establish the US as a stable beacon of hope internationally. He meets up with many European and Western leaders to try to re-establish close diplomatic ties. However, the wounds created by the Civil War, even the international ones, will take years or even decades to heal. That is, if the world can find a peaceful path in such a dystopian scenario. However, how this story continues beyond 2021 is up to your imagination now. Thank you so much for watching episode 3, the final episode of America Burns. If you enjoyed this video, it would mean the world to me if you could like and subscribe to help the channel grow. Because I cover some pretty controversial topics, it's tough to make much from monetization, so I'm thinking about creating a Patreon. Please let me know in the comments if you think that's a good idea. If you're interested in more videos like this, check out the ones on screen. On the left is a wild alternate history where Dick Cheney's daughter is straight, which somehow leads to the US invading Iran. Yeah, it's crazy, but worth watching. And if you're hungry for more Civil War scenarios, on the right is a shorter dive into the Second Russian Civil War in the 90s. Thank you again for your support, and I'll see you next time.